Aristotle. When we think of Aristotle, we picture the genius who taught Alexander the Great and shaped science, ethics, and politics for 2,000 years. But behind that brilliance lies one of philosophy's darkest arguments. In the 4th century BCE, within a world where nearly a third of Athens' population were slaves, Aristotle tried to explain, not challenge, the injustice around him. He believed nature itself created hierarchy. In his Politics, he wrote that some people are slaves by nature, born to obey rather than command, their bodies strong for labor, but their reason too weak for independent thought. To him, master and slave were like soul and body. One ruled, one served. He even claimed this relationship benefited both sides. The master gained labor, the slave guidance. It was his way of giving moral logic to a social order that powered Greek democracy but rested on bondage. Aristotle's influence was unmatched. His works became textbooks for medieval scholars and church thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, who later used his reasoning to justify unequal hierarchies under divine law. Even in the Enlightenment, echoes of his natural slavery lingered in colonial arguments. By trying to explain the world as it was, Aristotle helped make moral blindness sound rational. His legacy reminds us that great minds can still defend terrible systems when comfort and custom feel like truth. Understanding him is uncomfortable but necessary because it shows how easily intelligence can become the servant of power.
Plato lived through war, political chaos, and the execution of his teacher, Socrates. It convinced him that a stable state mattered more than personal liberty. In his ideal city, described in The Republic and the Laws, every role had its place. The rulers governed by reason, the soldiers defended, and the workers labored. He rarely mentioned slavery outright, because to him it was as ordinary as daylight. Athens already relied on thousands of enslaved people to function. In Plato's imagined society, slaves were mostly foreigners captured in war or bought in trade. They performed manual work so citizens could focus on virtue and philosophy. He never condemned the institution. Instead, he took it as part of natural order, discussing how masters should treat slaves moderately, not whether anyone had the right to own another human. For Plato, harmony meant everyone knowing their proper station, even if that station was bondage. His silence became an endorsement. Later thinkers, especially Aristotle, expanded these assumptions into full theories of natural inequality. Plato wasn't cruel, he was simply unable or unwilling to picture a world where reason and slavery couldn't coexist. That blindness set the tone for centuries of political thought, utopias built on other people's labor.
Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, tried to merge Greek reason with Christian faith. He admired Aristotle deeply, calling him the philosopher, and trusted his logic almost as much as scripture. When he confronted the question of slavery, his goal wasn't to abolish it, but to fit it neatly inside divine law. In Summa Theologica, Aquinas argued that under God's perfect order, all souls were equal, but human society, scarred by sin, required hierarchy. He quoted Aristotle to say that some must serve others, and claimed slavery could arise by human law, either through war, debt, or punishment. To him, owning another person wasn't automatically unjust if used for the master's and servant's mutual benefit. The reasoning gave Christian Europe a moral blueprint. Churchmen could preach charity, while kingdoms trafficked in flesh. Aquinas didn't invent slavery, but his theology gave it endurance, blending Greek philosophy with divine sanction. Centuries later, defenders of colonial slavery still cited him. His writing reminds us how easily faith and intellect can cooperate in explaining away cruelty, when reason seeks order more than justice.
John Locke, remembered as the father of modern democracy, the man who wrote that all people have a natural right to life, liberty, and property. Yet inside that same philosophy sat a quiet contradiction. Writing in the late 1600s, during Britain's rise as a colonial power, Locke helped draft constitutions for the Carolinas that protected slave ownership and invested in the Royal African Company, a major trader in enslaved Africans. In his two treatises of government, Locke argued that slavery was normally wrong because no one could sell his own life. But he carved out one chilling exception. Those captured in a just war, he said, could be enslaved rather than executed. That slight loophole became moral armor for countless Europeans who claimed every colonial war was just. Locke's influence shaped America's founders, the French Revolution, and global ideas of freedom, while that buried clause lingered in legal and economic systems built on human ownership. His legacy shows how even moral revolutions can leave back doors for injustice. The philosopher who inspired liberty's language also helped teach the world how to rationalize its limits.
Hugo Grotius. A century before Locke, Dutch thinker Hugo Grotius tried to create universal laws of war and peace. In the 1600s age of exploration, European powers desperately wanted rules that justified their expansion. Grotius provided them. In On the Law of War and Peace, 1625, he claimed slavery would be legitimate under two conditions. Captured enemies might be enslaved instead of killed, and a person could sell his freedom by contract. That neatly matched what European empires were already doing, enslaving defeated peoples and enforcing lifelong contracts. To Grotius, it wasn't cruelty, it was legality. His writing built the framework for international law, but it also tied lawful war to human bondage. Colonizers quoted him to prove their conquests moral. Yet Grotius wasn't malicious. He simply trusted legal logic more than moral outrage. By building rules for the empire, he helped formalize its conscience and prove that systematic thinking can make injustice sound perfectly civilized.
David Hume, the 18th century Scottish philosopher, helped define the modern scientific spirit. Doubt everything, rely on evidence, test ideas by experience. But when he applied that method to humanity, his own bias skewed the experiment. In a short note to an essay in 1753, he wrote that he suspected non-white peoples were naturally inferior, and that no civilized nation outside Europe had achieved culture or invention. Though brief, those words echoed across centuries. Hume invested in companies trading with the West Indies and never attacked slavery itself. For him, moral sense came from habit, not divine law, and his habits reflected a world already racialized. His students, including Adam Smith and even Kant, wrestled with those ideas, some repeating them. The tragedy is that a mind built on skepticism failed to question the biggest assumption of all, European superiority. Hume's case reminds us that even reason can inherit prejudice, and that intelligence alone cannot free anyone from the illusions of their own time.
Immanuel Kant, celebrated for asking us to act only on moral laws we would wish universal, for building ethics on pure reason rather than power or faith. Yet, in practice, he excluded millions from that circle of morality. Writing in late 18th century Prussia, he accepted slavery as part of colonial necessity and classified non-Europeans as immature stages of human development. In his Anthropology from a Pragmatic Point of View, he grouped races into a hierarchy: white Europeans at the summit, Africans and indigenous peoples at the base, claiming it reflected nature's design for progress. While condemning personal cruelty, Kant argued that savages needed discipline and that European domination would spread enlightenment. His careful tone gave prejudice a scholarly voice. Later, his language shaped 19th century theories of racial evolution and colonial expansion. His brilliance marked a turning point: morality universal in theory, exclusionary in application. Understanding Kant's blind spot matters because it exposes philosophy's double edge. The pursuit of reason can still serve the comfort of the empire.
Hegel, who saw history as the evolution of human consciousness driven by conflict between master and slave. But while he described that struggle as the engine of self-awareness, He admired civilizations where actual slavery existed. To him, ancient Greece and Rome achieved cultural heights precisely because citizens were freed from labor through a servile class. In his lectures on world history, Hegel dismissed Africa as outside history, a place of nature, not reason, echoing Kant's ladder of progress. Hegel's system turned domination into a philosophical stage. Humanity learns freedom only by first living through bondage. That abstraction let real oppression hide behind lofty theory. Ironically, later thinkers like Marx would reinterpret the master-slave conflict as a call for liberation. But Hegel himself treated slavery less as a crime, more as a necessary lesson in spirit's march. His dialectic shows how intellect can transform suffering into a concept, and how easily history's victims become its teachers.
George Fitzhugh. By the 1850s, abolition debates were tearing the United States apart. In Virginia, lawyer and writer George Fitzhugh became slavery's fiercest apologist. He published Sociology for the South, 1854, and Cannibals All, 1857, arguing that slavery was a humane paternal system protecting inferior races and sparing them the cruelty of capitalism. He insisted that all labor, even northern factory work, was a form of slavery, and claimed Southern masters treated servants better than industrial bosses treated free workers. Fitzhugh quoted philosophers from Aristotle to Hegel, stitching old hierarchies into a modern defense. He dismissed liberty as chaos and preached that submission brought order, morality, and Christian care. After the Civil War, his ideas collapsed alongside the Confederacy. But his writings show how erudition can wrap barbarity in paternal language. His story closes the arc from ancient Greece to modern America. 2,000 years of intellect trying to explain away injustice, only to prove that no system, however logical, can make owning another human being anything but wrong.
Baruch Spinoza, a 17th century Dutch-Portuguese philosopher, preached freedom of thought, separation of church and state, and tolerance, ideas that would later form the skeleton of modern democracy. Yet when it came to slavery, he stayed silent, or worse, indifferent. Living in Amsterdam, at the heart of the Dutch trading empire, he saw slavery every day. The Dutch West India Company trafficked thousands of Africans across the Atlantic, and Spinoza's neighbors profited from it. In his theological political treatise, he defined freedom as the ability to use reason, not as a universal right. Those governed by passion, he wrote, were naturally fit to serve. It wasn't a direct defense of slavery, but it fit the same old pattern, calling bondage a social necessity for those lacking rational discipline. That quiet complicity mattered. Spinoza's rational vision redefined liberty as an internal state, leaving real chains unchallenged. His legacy warns us that even ideals built on reason can turn away from injustice when comfort or caution make silence easier than truth.
Cicero, when all men share reason, he still owned slaves and defended the Roman laws that reduced millions to property. In his De Officiis, he described slavery as part of a stable society. It was wrong to treat a slave cruelly, he said, yet still right to keep one. His moral rules stopped at the empire's borders. To Cicero, virtue meant protecting Rome's hierarchy, not erasing it. He believed the empire itself was civilization's proof, and since its power depended on slaves, so did its virtue. His writings became a model for later humanist thinkers, shaping law and civic ethics for 2,000 years, but they also carried the flaw of their foundation. Justice defined only among equals, never for all humans. Cicero's brilliance gave slavery the voice of moderation, which history found harder to reject than cruelty itself.
John Calvin, born in 1509, transformed Christianity's landscape during the Reformation, preaching that salvation came from God's grace, not good deeds. But his strict reading of Scripture left little room for social revolt. In his commentary on Ephesians, he called slavery a condition of life permissible under divine order, comparing it to servanthood before God.
Masters, he warned, must be fair, but he never argued they shouldn't own other people. His Geneva became famous for discipline. Citizens watched by ministers and moral police. The same theology that promised equality of souls also demanded unquestioning obedience on earth. Protestant merchants later used Calvin's logic to reconcile faith with Atlantic slavery, arguing that hierarchy and hard labor were God's instruments of discipline. Calvin's focus on divine will over human justice let inequality hide behind piety. The reformer who set spirits free in religion helped keep bodies bound in practice, a paradox that shadowed Christian thought for centuries.
Epicurus, born in 341 BCE on the island of Samos, founded a school that promised tranquility through simple living, friendship, and the absence of fear. His garden in Athens welcomed women and people of modest status, a radical act for its time. But even in the circle of intellectual equality, the old world still ruled outside its walls. Epicurus owned slaves, called them companions, and never challenged the institution itself. In his letters, he advised treating slaves kindly because anger and cruelty disturbed a master's peace of mind, yet his reasoning stayed self-centered. Freedom, for him, was mental, not social. Anyone, even a slave, could be inwardly free by mastering fear and desire. It sounded humane, but it turned injustice into a private problem rather than a public wrong. His attitude spread across the Hellenistic world. Kindness as consolation instead of equality as principle. Stoics would later echo this same detachment. Epicurus reminds us that philosophy can build gardens of serenity while the city beyond still runs on chains, and that comfort without confrontation can make even peace part of the problem.
Stoics, who rose in the early centuries of Greece and Rome, teaching resilience in a world where slavery was everywhere. Their founders, Zeno, Cleanthes, later Romans like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, believed virtue came from reason, not status. To them, a wise man could be enslaved and still be free, because true liberty lived in the mind. It was profound psychology, but it also excused injustice. Seneca, advisor to Emperor Nero, owned hundreds of slaves, yet wrote that masters should treat servants kindly, because cruelty degraded the soul. He never called for abolition or questioned property over people. Epictetus, once a slave himself, echoed the same paradox. He taught that his body belonged to his master, but his thoughts belonged to him. Even the Emperor Marcus Aurelius spoke in benevolence towards servants, calling kindness an act of philosophy, not equality. The Stoics gave generations a moral coping mechanism. Endure, accept, control only what's within you. But that endurance sometimes became surrender. It made oppression seem inevitable, even natural. Their wisdom shaped Western ethics for 2,000 years, and their silence on slavery shows how even the pursuit of serenity can become an ally of injustice when peace matters more than change.
Alexis de Tocqueville. Born to French aristocracy in 1805, Tocqueville traveled to the young United States searching for democracy's secrets. His book, Democracy in America, 1835 to 1840, became a masterpiece. He admired the vitality of civic life and freedom of speech, yet could not fully condemn the system's deepest sin, slavery. He called it morally wrong but politically untouchable, worrying that abolition might destroy democracy itself. Back home, Tocqueville entered French politics and confronted a second contradiction. As France colonized Algeria in the 1840s, he defended harsh conquest and forced labor as a civilizing mission. In letters to Parliament, he urged stronger occupation, arguing that domination was necessary to uplift backward peoples. The same thinker who praised liberty tolerated empire and racial hierarchy when practiced under France's flag. His words echo the Enlightenment's last blind spot, equality as a national ideal, but not yet a human one. Tocqueville's legacy remains mixed. He diagnosed tyranny of the majority, promoted liberal reforms, but rationalized colonial violence.
He ends this list much as it began, with a brilliant mind proving that great political insight can coexist with moral compromise, and that freedom spoken narrowly can be as dangerous as tyranny itself.